She thought she married a prince, but woke up beside a predator. They called it a perfect love. From the outside, it looked effortless, the shy grace of a small town woman hand in hand with the polished air of a family fortune. People watched them walk by and felt a quiet envy. He smiled like someone who had nothing to hide. She loved like someone who had never been hurt. But that's the danger, isn't it? Not the kind that screams or strikes, the kind that whispers sweet promises while setting traps behind closed doors. Serafina didn't fall because she was weak. She gave herself because he gave her every reason to believe it was safe. He made her feel like she belonged somewhere sacred, in his world, in his arms, in his forever. He kissed her knuckles like they were glass, pulled out chairs for her, at every dinner, whispered devotion in the quiet hum of twilight. And when he looked at her, it wasn't just affection, it was awe. That's how it seemed anyway. To everyone else, it was a fairy tale. To Serafina, it was home, until the mask began to slip. And what lies beneath charm isn't always empty. Sometimes it's calculated. What happens when everything you trusted starts to crack? What do you do when the person who once held your face like it was, the most precious thing in the world, begins to lie without blinking? Before we go further into this haunting and deeply personal story, take a second to subscribe. This tale doesn't end in silence. It ends in fire, and you'll want to be here for every moment. Because this isn't just about betrayal. This is about a woman who loved gently, lost everything quietly, and rose, not to destroy, but to tell the truth. And, sometimes, truth is louder than vengeance. There were signs, small ones at first. A pause too long when she asked where he'd been. A second phone, he said, was for work emergencies. The way he smiled at her, not the soft, familiar smile she once knew, but something thinner, more practiced. Still, she told herself it was stress, business, the weight of legacy. Men like him carried names before they carried love. That's what she told herself. Because believing in someone becomes a habit. And habits, even the beautiful ones, can make you ignore the quiet ache in your gut. He had woven a world so convincing, even her instincts began to feel like betrayal. She would sit in their kitchen, the one with the white stone counters and copper kettles he picked, out himself, and replay every word, every glance, searching for a reason to still believe him. And when belief began to fade, she clung to memory. She remembered the evening he kissed her wrist under the lanterns and said, "You calm the chaos in me." She remembered how, on their wedding night, he held her face with both hands and whispered, "I will never be the man who forgets how lucky I am." But memory cannot fight reality forever. The truth has a way of leaking in, like light through cracks in stained glass, soft, slow, undeniable. And once Serafina allowed herself to look, really look, what she found wasn't just infidelity. It was something colder, something deliberate. She had trusted him with the softest parts of herself, the parts that take years to build and seconds to shatter. And yet, even in that quiet devastation, she didn't break. She watched, she waited, and when the time came, she acted, not with rage, but with focus, because some betrayals aren't meant to be mourned, they're meant to be answered. There's a certain kind of silence that comes after heartbreak, not loud or messy, but still, heavy, like the house remembers the laughter and holds its breath. That's the silence Serafina lived in for weeks. She didn't confront him at first. She wasn't ready to speak. She was still learning how to breathe in this new, sharp reality. So she became still, careful. He thought she was distracted, distant, maybe tired from hosting his charity events or attending another dinner with his colleagues who spoke in circles. He didn't notice that her silence was watching. She started to see everything differently. The quick way he brushed past her questions, the red lipstick on a glass in his car, the calls that always ended the moment she stepped into the room. The spell had broken, and now she was gathering pieces, not of her heart, that would come later, but of him. She began with his office, the drawer he always locked, the envelope tucked inside the lining of his suitcase, the email left open on his tablet, numbers that didn't add up, names that didn't belong. It wasn't just about who he was seeing. It was about what he was doing, what he was hiding. Each discovery pulled her further from the illusion, but strangely, closer to herself. The version of Serafina who once whispered apologies when he snapped at her was gone. So was the woman who second-guessed her gut to protect his comfort. What remained was someone quiet and unshakable. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She planned. Because this wasn't just betrayal. It was deception crafted by a man who thought charm would protect him from consequence. But he underestimated the woman he once called my greatest treasure. He thought she would bury the truth. Instead, she carried it, straight into the light. There comes a moment, quiet but absolute, when you stop waiting for someone to become who they promised to be. Serafina reached that moment with the stillness of someone who had cried all her tears in secret. She didn't want revenge. She wanted truth to stand up straight and speak without trembling. He had taken her trust and worn it like a suit, polished, convenient, disposable. But now, she would be the one writing the ending. She stopped asking where he'd been. She stopped pretending not to notice. She started gathering. Receipts, names, whispered confessions from staff who had seen too much and said too little. Emails, documents, enough to make sure that when the time came, his story wouldn't just fall apart, it would collapse with witnesses. Because the real heartbreak wasn't the affair. It wasn't even the lies. It was realizing that a man who once kissed her with reverence could look her in the eyes and tell a lie so seamless, so effortless, it nearly sounded like love. And yet, she didn't let it harden her. She still watered her garden. She still greeted the maid with warmth. She still wore the necklace he gave her on their second anniversary, not because she cherished it, but because she wanted to remember who she had been when she received it. Not naive, just honest, whole, unashamed of her ability to love deeply, because no betrayal could change that. And when the moment finally arrived, when the mask fully cracked and the truth stood exposed, she didn't raise her voice. She simply said, "I know who you are now, and I have proof." The look on his face wasn't rage. It was fear, not of her, but of what she had built while he was underestimating her. And from that moment on, it wasn't his story anymore. It was hers. So stay with us, because what happened next didn't just end a marriage. It ended a lie that had lived for too long. And it reminded the world that quiet women do not mean weak women. Sometimes it means they're waiting for the right moment to speak. And when they do, everything changes. Willow Creek wasn't the kind of place that made headlines. It was slow mornings, familiar faces, and porches that whispered stories at sunset. Folks knew each other's grandmothers, and Sundays were for church, sweet tea, and rest. Serafina lived quietly, not shy, just content. She wore linen dresses that danced in the wind and spent her mornings helping at the local library, where children clung to her voice as she read old stories with new wonder. She had a softness about her, not weakness, but the kind of calm strength that made people lean in. She didn't chase attention. She didn't have to. People noticed her the way you notice a candle in a dark room, warm, steady, never trying to outshine, yet impossible to ignore. She lived with her aunt in a modest home shaded by oaks, the kind of house that always smelled faintly of honey and clean laundry. They didn't have much, but they had each other. Serafina's world was small, but it was safe, and in many ways, sacred. Alaric changed that. He arrived like something from another world. Tailored suits, imported cologne, a voice that moved like velvet across a room. His family name sat on buildings and bank accounts. Everyone in town knew who he was. He wasn't just wealthy, he was legacy. And legacy didn't usually walk into the town diner asking for coffee with a grin that could talk the sun into staying out longer. He noticed Serafina the first time she refilled his cup. He asked her name. She answered politely and moved on, not thinking twice. But he came back, again and again. He didn't ask for her number. He asked about her favorite books, her dreams, whether she liked stars or sunsets better, whether she'd ever thought about leaving Willow Creek. At first she thought it was kindness, curiosity, maybe even boredom. But weeks passed, and his questions turned into walks. His walks turned into letters. And slowly, almost shyly, she began to let him in. He said her voice calmed him, that her presence felt like a place he'd never known he missed. And Serafina, who had never once believed she needed more than what she had, began to wonder if love was something she had only seen from a distance, until now. There was something about the way he looked at her that made the world around them blur. Alaric wasn't just handsome, he carried himself with a confidence that suggested he never heard no without a backup plan. But with Serafina, he didn't lead with charm. He led with curiosity. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, it wasn't to impress, it was to learn. They met on porches, not in ballrooms. He walked her home after long shifts, not because he had to, but because he said, You deserve company, even when the day has taken too much from you. And for a while, nothing about them felt like a performance. It felt quiet, natural, like 2 pages in the same book that had finally been placed side by side. The town watched with fascination. Whispers followed them down cobbled sidewalks. Alaric Moore and Serafina Wells? Can you believe it? She must have cast a spell on him. He hasn't looked at anyone else since she came into the picture. Some were curious. A few were skeptical, but most were charmed. There was a beauty in watching opposites fold into one another. Her grace, his fire, her stillness, his ambition. Together, they looked like a story worth believing in. Even her aunt, who had raised Serafina with quiet caution, found herself softening. "Be careful with your heart," she warned one night as Serafina combed through handwritten notes Alaric had left in her mailbox. Serafina only smiled, holding one of the letters to her chest. "He sees me," she whispered. Not just the idea of me. And that was the difference. She had never been pursued like this, not with extravagance, but with intention. He remembered her favorite flower was lavender, not roses. He knew she preferred quiet jazz over orchestras. He brought her books with pages already bookmarked, with notes in the margins. "This reminded me of you." Theirs wasn't a whirlwind. It was a steady pull, and before she knew it, Sunday afternoons became their afternoons. Her name felt different when he said it, softer, safer. She didn't know if it was love yet, but she knew it was changing her. Alaric didn't propose with a spotlight. There were no photographers hiding in the trees or crowds holding signs. It happened one quiet evening beneath the wisteria-covered arbor behind her aunt's house. Fireflies blinked softly in the distance, and the scent of lemon balm lingered in the air from her garden. Serafina had just laughed, one of those full, head-tipped back laughs, and when she turned to look at him, he was already on one knee. No rehearsed speech, just a single sentence. "Will you build the rest of your days with me?" She froze, hand to her chest, eyes wide and glassy. He offered her a ring, not loud, not massive, but thoughtful. A delicate gold band with a stone the color of morning sky. Not because it cost the most, but because it reminded him of how her eyes looked when she cried the first time he told her he loved her. She said yes, with a voice just above a whisper. And when he stood to kiss her, her fingers trembled slightly against his neck, as though she was holding something she never thought she'd have. The news traveled quickly through Willow Creek. By morning, every corner of the town was humming with it. The girl who read to children at the library was marrying Alaric Moore. Some were surprised, others quietly thrilled. Most were simply caught in the beauty of it, the notion that, too, people from different worlds could find something rare and genuine. The wedding was held at the old chapel on Marigold Street, the same place her parents had exchanged vows decades earlier. Rows of white chairs were draped in soft linen, and lavender sprigs filled the air with sweetness. Her dress was ivory, handmade, sleeveless, with a row of tiny buttons down the back that her aunt fastened with trembling hands. When Serafina walked down the aisle, no one breathed. Alaric watched her the way a man watches something he knows he doesn't deserve. And she looked like peace in motion. They exchanged vows beneath stained glass lit by the afternoon sun, and when the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, the town erupted in applause, not loud but heartfelt. Tears, smiles, nods of approval, because that day it felt like love had won. Marriage at first felt like an exhale. They moved into the Moore estate just outside town, a sprawling home with long windows, white shutters, and a garden so wide it felt like its own world. The groundskeeper had once kept it trimmed and perfect, but Serafina let the wildflowers grow tall along the edges. She said not everything beautiful needed to be tamed. Their bedroom overlooked the orchard. In the mornings, Alaric brought her tea on a silver tray. In the evenings, she read aloud while he rested his head in her lap, listening, with eyes closed, one hand gently tracing the inside of her wrist. They danced in the kitchen, left notes for each other in jacket pockets. He'd lean in and kiss her shoulder while she stirred soup on the stove, whispering, "I still can't believe you're mine." To the world, it was a perfect match. To her, it felt like home had stretched itself to fit two hearts. She didn't question the sudden flood of wealth, the staff, the trips, the parties. She only saw a man who worked hard and came home with a smile. And even when certain guests made her uncomfortable, women who held Alaric's gaze just a little, too long, or men who spoke in hushed tones about private ventures, she pushed the doubts away. Love meant trust, and Serafina had given hers fully, Comment below if you've ever thought you found the one, only to realize they weren't who they claimed to be. Your story might help someone feel less alone. She had no reason to expect anything less than forever. He'd promised her that, not just with vows but in 100 small ways. The way he touched the small of her back when they walked into a room. The way he introduced her as my heart. The way he looked at her like she was the calm in a storm he never spoke about. And she believed him. Completely. But belief, no matter how deep, doesn't make someone honest. And some love stories aren't lies. They're performances. Polished, practiced, and dangerously convincing. For a time, Serafina lived in that performance. And it almost became her reality. The days that followed their wedding moved like a slow song. Serafina often woke before the sun, not out of duty, but out of peace. The mornings were cool and quiet, filled with the rustling of trees outside, their window, and the faint aroma of jasmine from the garden below. Alaric always stirred just after her. He would reach across the bed, eyes still closed, and pull her close. His voice, deep with sleep, would mumble, "Don't go yet. Stay here, just a little longer." Sometimes she did, just to hear his heartbeat against her cheek, just to believe in the warmth of it all. Breakfasts were simple, but filled with care. He insisted on making her eggs, always slightly overcooked, but she ate them anyway. Said they tasted better when someone else made them with love. He laughed at that, kissed the top of her head and said, "Then you must be tasting a feast." There was a softness to their life, not in extravagance, but in consistency. Every Friday, he left her handwritten notes in the front cover of a novel she hadn't read yet. Chapter 3 reminds me of how you looked the first night I saw you smile. Page 89. I hope you never forget how powerful your silence is. She kept them all in a wooden box lined with velvet. One day, she thought, she would read them again with wrinkled hands and a heart still full. In the evenings, they often walked to the edge of the estate, where a small lake mirrored the sky. He'd bring a blanket and a bottle of wine, and they would lie side by side as the stars slipped quietly into view. He told her stories of his childhood, how he'd sneak away from formal dinners to catch frogs in the creek, how he once failed a spelling test and cried not because he got the answers wrong, but because he thought he'd disappointed his father. "I don't want to be that man," he said softly one night, eyes fixed on the sky. "I want to be different with you." And she believed him. Because vulnerability feels like truth when it comes from someone you love. Dinner was never just a meal. He insisted on setting the table himself, linen napkins, polished silver, and candles that flickered like tiny heartbeats. Serafina would walk in from the garden or the bath, and he'd be there, shirt, sleeves rolled up, smiling as if he'd been waiting all day just to see her. "Sit," he'd say. "Tonight, the world can wait." He always poured her water before wine, said hydration was the mark of a man who truly cared. It was ridiculous and charming and utterly him. Their conversations flowed the way good music does, slowly, with rhythm, with pause and grace. He asked about her day, not as a formality, but like someone who wanted to live inside her thoughts. She told him things she didn't even know she'd been holding. They didn't always talk. Some nights they let the silence stretch, hands intertwined across the table as the soft crackle of the fireplace filled the room. After dinner, he'd often read to her, essays, letters from old poets, or stories he remembered from childhood. He said her voice was made for warmth, but his voice was made for weight. Together, they balanced. "I used to think success was everything," he whispered once, his fingers brushing her collarbone. "But then I met you, and now, I just want a life that feels like this." One evening, she returned from a short visit to her aunt's, only to find the house filled with the scent of cedarwood and cinnamon. A trail of petals, not roses, but lilac, her favorite, led from the front door to the library. There, he stood with a small leather-bound book in hand. It was blank, except for the first page, "For the woman who taught me stillness." "Let's fill this with our real life, the kind that doesn't need applause." She pressed the book to her chest and wept. He held her without asking why. And that was what made it so easy to trust him. He didn't always give answers. He gave presence. He met her sadness with space, her joy with reflection, her questions with arms wide enough to hold the unknown. She had never belonged to anyone. But slowly, beautifully, she began to believe she belonged with him. They made a habit of ending their nights beside the lake. No music, no phones, no interruptions, just the cool hush of water, the quiet hum of crickets, and a blanket stretched across the grass beneath them. Some nights they barely spoke. Others, they spoke about everything: dreams, regrets, childhood memories too fragile to tell before trust had ripened. One night, as summer deepened and the stars pressed closer to earth, Serafina leaned her head against Alaric's chest and closed her eyes. The world felt very far away, safe. He ran his fingers through her hair slowly, deliberately, like he wanted to memorize the motion. "You ever wonder," he murmured, "how many lives we lived before this one? And whether we ever found each other there too?" She smiled faintly, her eyes still closed. "Maybe in every version of time, we were meant to meet." He went quiet for a long moment, then sat up, gently pulling her with him. The moonlight brushed against the edge of his face. He looked at her like he'd never seen her before, like something had clicked open inside him and left him raw. "I need you to hear something," he said, voice low. "Not as something sweet, as something true." She nodded, lips parted, waiting. He cupped her face, thumbs resting just beneath her eyes. "As long as I breathe," he whispered, "you'll never know sorrow." Her heart stilled, not because of the words, but because of how he said them, not like a promise, but like a prayer. She touched his face gently. "You can't control life, Alaric." "I know," he said, "but I can control how I love you." She leaned in, slow and sure, and kissed him, not with passion, but with surrender. That night, something inside her settled. She no longer needed proof, no longer counted signs. She stopped wondering if love would last, and instead allowed herself to live in it fully, messy, holy, and without hesitation. That was the night she stopped holding back. She gave him everything, not in one moment, but in all the small ones that followed. Every soft glance across a crowded room, every hand she reached for before sleep, every quiet forgiveness when work pulled him away again and again. She didn't see the cracks forming in the corners. She only saw the light coming through. And she believed, with her whole soul, that what they had was forever. Their home became a museum of memories. Little pieces of love lived in every corner. A scarf draped over the armchair she always curled into, his watch left beside her favorite teacup. Framed photos from the coast where they spent a weekend doing nothing, but talking, swimming, and sharing stories no one else had ever heard. He bought her a piano, even though she'd never mentioned wanting one. "I thought it might suit the way you walk through the house," he said, placing a single daisy on the keys. She tried to learn, just for him. Her fingers stumbled, her posture was wrong, but when she played, even poorly, he sat and listened as though it was the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard. "It's not about the notes," he told her once. "It's the way you try. That's the part that moves me." And she believed him, because he had a way of making her feel like effort mattered more than perfection. That love wasn't something earned, but received, freely, constantly. On the evenings he returned late from the city, she stayed up. Always, no matter the hour. She sat in the library, book in lap, waiting for the sound of his car on gravel, for the keys in the door, for his tired sigh as he walked through the hallway. He never asked her to wait, but he always smiled when he saw her there, still awake. He'd ask, "Of course," she'd whisper, "you were coming home." He'd kiss her forehead and say, "I don't deserve this." She never asked what kept him so long. She assumed it was business, pressure, family obligations. He didn't always speak of those things, and she never pressed. Love, she believed, was not about interrogation. It was about presence. And his presence, even fleeting, still felt like enough. Until slowly, something shifted. He became distracted. Not cold, never that, but distant in a way that made her wonder if his mind was somewhere else. She'd speak, and he'd nod, but sometimes with a pause, as if catching up to the moment he was in. The notes continued. The kisses still came, but something behind his eyes had begun to flicker. She told herself it was pressure from work. Maybe he was building something in secret, a gift, a surprise, a plan to whisk her away. He had done that before. But a small, quiet part of her, the part she didn't listen to yet, began to notice. Still, she pushed the thought aside, because when you believe you've found peace, the last thing you want is to question it. And so she leaned harder into the love she knew, into the life they'd built, into the man who once vowed she'd never know sorrow. Because the thing about devotion is, it doesn't just hold on, it hopes, even when it shouldn't. It didn't happen all at once. There was no sharp turn, no sudden storm, just a softness that began to thin, like the fabric of something once warm, now worn at the edges. Serafina noticed it on a Tuesday. She had set out his favorite breakfast, even remembered the touch of cinnamon he always liked in his coffee. But when he came downstairs, he barely looked up from his phone. "Thanks," he said absently, pressing a quick kiss to her temple before stepping away. His lips were cold. She stood there, still holding the spoon, unsure if it was just her imagination, or if something had shifted between one heartbeat and the next. She told herself he was tired. That became the answer for everything. He was tired when he forgot to say goodnight. He was tired when he left for the office before sunrise. He was tired when he missed dinner 3 nights in a row. But fatigue doesn't explain silence, not the kind that lingers in a room even when you're sitting right beside each other. He still smiled, still reached for her hand in public, still left little notes here and there, but fewer now. Shorter, more rushed. Meeting went late. Love you. Early flight. We'll call after. No more poems in the margins. No more metaphors. Just statements. One morning she noticed a name flash across his phone as it buzzed on the counter. Danielle. No last name, no contact photo. Just that. And the quick way he flipped the phone over. Her breath caught for a moment, but she said nothing. She didn't want to seem suspicious. She didn't want to seem paranoid. He had never given her a reason to doubt him, not truly. And yet, that evening, when he came home, his jacket smelled unfamiliar. Not unpleasant, just different. A trace of something sweet. Too sweet. A scent that didn't belong to her, didn't match the soap they kept in the house, didn't match the quiet of their shared space. She stared at the coat for a long time after he hung it by the door. She didn't ask. Not yet. Because suspicion felt like betrayal, and if she asked, it would mean admitting that she no longer felt entirely safe in his truth, and she wasn't ready for that. Serafina had always trusted her intuition. It guided her through every season of her life, the unspoken sense of what felt right, what felt off, what deserved attention. But now, that inner voice had grown quiet. Not absent, but restrained, as if even her instincts were afraid to speak too loudly. She watched Alaric more closely than before, not in suspicion, but in longing, searching for the man who once looked at her like she was the beginning of everything. But his gaze had changed. Not cold, not cruel, just elsewhere. One evening, as they sat on opposite ends of the couch, she asked gently, "Is everything all right at work?" He looked up quickly, almost startled, then nodded. "Yeah, just a lot of moving parts right now," he said, voice too smooth. "Too quick. Nothing you need to worry about." He kissed her cheek and turned his attention back to the folder on his lap. She stared at the side of his face, wondering when the space between them had begun to grow. Later that night he left his phone in the bathroom. It buzzed once, a message preview lighting up the screen. She didn't mean to look, but the name flashed again, Danielle. The message read, "Still thinking about yesterday." Her hands went cold. She didn't open it. She didn't touch the phone. She only stared at it until the screen dimmed. When Alaric returned, she handed it to him calmly, her voice steady. "You left this." He smiled, kissed her fingers, said, "Thanks, my love," and placed it in his pocket. No password change, no urgency, no guilt. He didn't know she had seen, and she said nothing. She sat on the edge of their bed that night, her robe tied tightly at the waist, staring out the window into the dark. The moon hung low over the trees, and in the stillness of the hour, she felt something crack, not loudly but deep, a shift within. She didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, she tried to reason. Maybe Danielle was a colleague. Maybe the message was innocent. Maybe the perfume on his jacket came from a hug. Maybe she was being unkind, too suspicious, too easily shaken. She clung to those thoughts like a lifeline. Because to admit the truth, even silently, felt like stepping into cold water with no shore in sight. And she wasn't ready to swim. The days moved forward, but something inside her stayed still. Serafina began to perform the life she used to live, cooking his favorite meals, tending to the garden, making the bed with the same care she always had. But the rhythm felt forced, like she was rehearsing a role she no longer believed in. She had memorized his habits, the way he always took his calls near the back window, the specific drawer where he kept his keys, how he kissed her shoulder absent-mindedly when walking past her. But now, some of those patterns had changed. He took more calls outside, closed the door when he showered, left early and came home later, always with a reason. Always plausible, always gentle. It was hard to hate a man who still brought her coffee. But kindness doesn't cancel confusion. One afternoon, as she gathered laundry from their bedroom, something slipped from the inner pocket of his blazer. A receipt. It wasn't unusual. Alaric often forgot to clear them out. But this one wasn't from a restaurant they'd been to together. It was for a boutique, expensive, discreet, in the city. She turned it over in her hands, her breath catching as she read the item description. Silk wrap, custom color blend, fragrant set, warm floral. The same warm floral she'd smelled on his jacket. Her stomach tightened. She sat on the edge of their bed, the receipt resting on her lap like a confession. Her mind raced, but her body stayed completely still. It wasn't just the item. It was the signature at the bottom, not his, but a woman's. She read it again. It wasn't her handwriting. It wasn't her scent. It wasn't for her. Later that evening, she placed the receipt back exactly where she found it. She didn't bring it up. She didn't question him. He came home tired, kissed her cheek, and said, "Missed you today." She smiled, but something in her eyes had gone quiet. That night, after he fell asleep, she lay beside him in silence, eyes wide open, tracing the ceiling with her gaze. She didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, she whispered, barely audible, "Please tell me I'm wrong." Not to him, to herself. Because it's easier to beg your own heart for mercy than to face what's already begun. There is a certain ache that comes when clarity settles in, not like a scream, but like a door gently closing behind you. Serafina woke before dawn the next morning, her body still curled toward his, but her heart far away. She studied his face as he slept, the soft lines, the way his mouth relaxed, how peaceful he looked. She wondered how long he'd been lying with her in body only. She didn't move, just lay there, breathing in silence, watching a version of him she could no longer fully trust. Later that day, while folding laundry, she found a smudge of lipstick on his collar. Not hers. A muted coral, barely visible unless the light caught it. It wasn't the first mark. It wasn't even the boldest. But it was the one that ended the argument in her mind. She sat in the laundry room, the shirt in her lap, and whispered, "So this is what it feels like." Not rage, not shock, just the dull sting of realization. She wanted to be wrong. She had hoped, prayed, pleaded with herself for another explanation. But there was no story left that made sense anymore. No excuse elegant enough to explain away all the missing pieces. He was slipping away from her, and he wasn't stumbling. He was walking. She had loved him so fully, so freely, that she never imagined he would ever choose elsewhere. But love, no matter how deep, can't hold someone who's already decided to let go. That evening, as he poured them both a drink, she watched his hands. They were steady, confident, not the hands of a man who felt guilt. He asked about her day. She told him it was fine. He kissed her forehead. She didn't flinch, but inside, something had changed. She no longer waited for explanations, no longer rehearsed how to ask without sounding accusatory. She knew, not from a single moment, but from all of them stacked together, a pattern too precise to ignore. And now she had a choice. She could pretend a little longer, keep living in the shell of what once was, or she could start listening to the part of herself that had been whispering, "Look closer." That night, Serafina stood in front of the mirror longer than usual, not to admire, not to assess, just to see herself, as she was now, changed, still standing, still her. And somewhere beneath the ache, beneath the trembling, beneath the quiet, a seed of something new began to form. Not anger, not revenge, awareness. There's a moment when sorrow stops asking questions. It doesn't plead. It doesn't wonder. It simply watches. Serafina had reached that point. She no longer searched for explanations in his voice or waited for his eyes to soften. She stopped folding his shirts with hope, stopped listening at the door for the sound of him coming home. She still moved through the motions, polite, warm, unbothered. But beneath her stillness was a woman rearranging her understanding of the man she married. The man who once memorized the way she braided her hair now flinched when she touched his wrist. He wasn't pulling away by accident. He was leaving. Quietly, deliberately, and she wasn't going to let him vanish into silence. That Friday morning, she watched him as he packed for a meeting in the city. He chose a tie she'd never seen before, slid a watch over his wrist, and combed his hair with a precision that didn't belong to boardrooms or negotiations. He smelled like cologne she didn't recognize. His shoes were polished, his mouth careful. He kissed her cheek and told her not to wait up. She nodded, and when the door closed behind him, she didn't cry. She went to the hallway, picked up her coat, and followed him. Not immediately. She waited 5 minutes, exactly 5, then slipped out the side entrance and drove her aunt's old car, keeping 2 vehicles between them the whole way. She didn't know what she was looking for, but she knew she couldn't keep pretending. The city opened before her, glass towers, busy streets, and the kind of noise that felt like it could drown anything. She followed him to a quiet cafe tucked between tall buildings. Watched as he sat at a small table near the window. She was ready for disappointment. What she wasn't ready for was how softly he smiled when she arrived. The woman wore a deep green coat. She touched his hand like she'd done it before. She laughed without reservation, leaned forward when he spoke, and reached into her purse to hand him something. A card? A letter? Serafina didn't move. She stood across the street, watching through glass, her body still but her breath shallow. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't harmless. This was familiarity, comfort, connection. Her heart didn't break all at once. It fractured, slowly, deliberately, like something being unstitched thread by thread. But it didn't end there, because betrayal, when it grows in quiet places, rarely stops at love. She didn't go home that night. She didn't confront him. She didn't give him the satisfaction of knowing she had seen. Instead, she stayed in the city. She checked into a modest hotel 2 blocks away, one of those old buildings with floral curtains and front desk clerks who asked no questions. She sat on the edge of the bed, still in the same coat, shoes still on, hands resting on her knees. The image of Alaric with that woman, the way his shoulders had relaxed, the way his eyes had crinkled in a smile that no longer belonged to her, played in her mind on a loop. But it wasn't jealousy that kept her awake. It was the lie, the gall of it, the precision. He had rehearsed this life, the gifts, the dinners, the notes, while building another one in shadows. And the deeper pain wasn't that he was disloyal. It was that he had turned her trust into a tool for convenience. She barely slept. The next morning she returned to the cafe, not because she expected him, but because she needed to understand. There, in the glow of morning traffic, she saw him again. Not with a woman this time. Alone, dressed in a different suit, briefcase in hand. She followed, not like a spy, like someone who was done pretending she didn't deserve the truth. He entered a tall building tucked between a law office and a finance firm. She watched the name etched in brass by the door, Benton Marsh Holdings. The name meant nothing to her, yet. She waited until he was gone from view, then circled the building until she found a side entrance left partially open. She slipped inside and blended in. The elevator required a pass. She took the stairs. 4 flights up, she reached a floor of offices behind frosted glass. And there, through the blur, she saw him, not the husband who once read her poetry, but a man sitting across from 2 men in suits, laughter in his throat, confidence in his posture. She moved quietly, closer to one of the unlocked doors. And then she heard it. "Don't worry," one of the men said. "We keep the workers off the books until the final quarter, same as last time," Alaric replied. "And the cut to partner shares?" "Already done. The paperwork's buried. No one's asking questions." Serafina froze, not because she didn't understand, but because she did. It wasn't just cheating, it was theft. He wasn't just betraying her. He was building an empire on the backs of people who would never know his name, using loopholes, slashing protections, hiding income streams to avoid taxes, and disguising abuse behind clean spreadsheets and fake smiles. She backed away, each step heavier than the last. She thought of the charities he proudly funded, the speeches about legacy, the nights he whispered, "I want to do good in this world." And she realized those weren't lies told in desperation. They were performances, meant for applause, meant for headlines, meant for her. Her knees weakened, but she stayed upright. Because now, this wasn't just personal, it was bigger. It was cruel, and it had to be exposed. If you were in Serafina's shoes, what would you do next? Let us know in the comments below. Your voice matters, just like hers. She returned home before him. There was no storm in her step, no shattered plates or confrontations, only stillness. She changed her clothes, brushed her hair, and made tea. By the time Alaric walked through the door with his usual grin and tired sigh, she was already seated by the window pretending to read. "Long day?" he asked. She looked up, her face soft, unreadable. Always. He kissed her forehead and went upstairs. She sipped her tea. The mask had become weightless. She wore it now not to protect him, but to protect herself, because the truth deserved more than rage. It deserved precision. The next morning, while he showered, she entered his office. She knew the drawer he always kept locked. She also knew where he hid the key. It took 12 seconds to open. Inside, a ledger. Clean at first glance, but with handwritten annotations that didn't match the official lines. Extra columns. Coded notes. She photographed every page. The safe behind the bookshelf opened with his mother's birthdate. He used it for everything. Even his phone password hadn't changed in over a year. Inside, 2 USB drives, contracts folded tightly, and a manila envelope with bank statements from overseas accounts. Names she didn't recognize. Amounts that made her breath catch. These weren't private investments. They were concealed funds, and if the notations were correct, most of them came from companies he had quietly gutted, repackaged, and sold off under new names. With workers unpaid, pensions frozen, benefits stripped, all hidden under layers of forged signatures and temporary shell firms. She placed everything back exactly as she found it. Not a paper bent, not a folder out of place. She left the room and made breakfast. When he walked in minutes later, tying his tie, she smiled at him across the kitchen island. Poached or scrambled? She asked. Surprise me, he said with a wink. He didn't know he was already losing. He didn't know the woman across from him, the one who once measured love by tenderness, had learned to measure it by truth. She fed him breakfast, kissed him goodbye, watched his car disappear down the road. And then she picked up the burner phone she'd bought in the city. She called a name she hadn't said in years, someone who owed her aunt a favor, someone who worked. In private finance law, someone who knew how to trace money when others tried to hide it. I need you to look at something, she said. Quietly. The voice on the other end was hesitant. Are you sure? She looked out at the garden, where golden leaves were beginning to fall across the stones. I'm sure, she said. And I'm done pretending I'm not. Names started to surface. One by one, the favor she called in turned into files. Files turned into phone calls. And those calls began painting a picture, not of a single man's mistake, but a system Alaric had carefully built to profit from harm. She spoke to a woman named Miriam, a former employee from one of the shell companies Alaric once absorbed, rebranded, and discarded. Miriam had worked there for 13 years. She lost everything when the firm collapsed without warning. Severance? Promised, never paid. Health benefits? Gone overnight. I thought it was just bad business, Miriam said over the phone. Now I know it was planned. We were numbers, nothing more. Another man, a retired welder, sent Serafina a scanned letter. It was his final appeal to the holding company after losing his retirement fund, addressed to a legal entity that no longer existed. It was dated 2 weeks before she and Alaric had celebrated their anniversary in Italy. Serafina read it 3 times. That trip, the ocean view suite, the private boat, the gold necklace he fastened around her neck, in the quiet of their hotel room, all of it had been paid for by people like him, people who were told there was nothing more to be done. She didn't feel pain anymore. She felt purpose. Every conversation, every document, every whisper of truth she gathered became a step forward, not just toward exposing him, but toward healing herself. Because what he stole from her was not just love. He stole her sense of safety, her belief in goodness, and worst of all, her ability to trust her own intuition. Until now she trusted herself more than anyone. She rented a safety deposit box under her maiden name. Inside it, she placed the printed ledgers, a flash drive, sworn statements, and a signed affidavit from a former board member willing to talk, anonymously for now. She recorded everything. She backed it up twice. And when she looked at the small collection of truths she'd pieced together, she no longer saw a broken wife. She saw a witness, someone who had walked through the fire and come out with her eyes open. She sat beneath the old magnolia tree in their garden, watching golden leaves drift down across the bench where they used to share coffee. She had loved him there, laughed there, dreamed there. Now, she waited there. For the moment she would no longer keep his secrets. Because love, real love, does not require blindness. And justice, when it arrives gently, is still justice. In the days that followed, the silence felt heavier than before. Not the kind that brings rest, but the kind that presses, slow, deliberate, suffocating. Serafina moved through her home like a ghost with a pulse. The place still smelled like lavender, the garden still bloomed, the piano still sat untouched in the corner, but nothing felt like hers anymore. Everything in that house had been curated to look like love, but now every cushion, every flower arrangement, every framed photograph felt like evidence in a case she hadn't meant to build, and the weight of what she knew was beginning to crush her. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Her hands trembled when she held a teacup. Her voice felt caught in her throat, even when no one was listening. It wasn't heartbreak, not anymore. It was the fear of what would come if she told the truth. Because Alaric wasn't just her husband. He wasn't just a man with two faces. He was a name people respected, a donor, a board member, a symbol of power. Someone whose family built libraries, who smiled with ministers and judges, whose wealth helped smooth the roads leading in and out of town. Serafina wasn't naive about what that meant. Men like Alaric didn't fall easily, and women like her, soft-spoken, gracious, private, weren't expected to raise their voices. She had seen what happened to women who did. They were called ungrateful, or worse, unstable. And yet, she couldn't look away anymore, because silence, she realized, wasn't safety. It was complicity, and she had already been quiet for too long. The turning point came on a Tuesday. She was walking past the mirror in the hallway, the full-length one Alaric had custom-framed for her birthday. She barely recognized herself. The woman in the reflection looked tired, hollow, like someone who had given everything she had, and had nothing left. But then she stepped closer, and she didn't see weakness. She saw evidence of survival, the sleepless nights, the steady hands photographing contracts, the quiet steps into his office when the world was asleep. She didn't see a broken woman. She saw a woman still standing, despite everything. She stared at herself for a long time. Then she whispered aloud, just once. Enough. It wasn't a cry. It was a vow. From that moment, she stopped waiting for fear to subside. She carried it with her, not as a burden, but as proof that she was no longer frozen. Her first call was to Miriam, the woman who'd lost everything when Alaric's silent corporate maneuvers left her jobless and uninsured. Serafina asked to meet in person. They chose a quiet cafe 2 towns over where no one knew either of their names. Miriam arrived early, wearing a plain cardigan and holding a folder tightly to her chest. Serafina offered a gentle smile as she slid into the booth across from her. I don't want revenge, she said. I want it to stop. Miriam's eyes filled with tears. So do I. She opened the folder. Inside were copies of her final paycheck, a letter of termination, internal memos she wasn't supposed to have. They weren't explosive, not by themselves, but Serafina could already see where they fit. Each document was a piece, and she was starting to see the whole picture. She created a master folder at the bank under a new alias, separate from her own name and address. Each time she uncovered a new thread, she copied it 3 times. 1 for the lawyer, 1 for backup, and 1 that never left her side. She bought a fireproof safe and installed it behind the shelf in the guest room. Alaric never went in there. Not once. He had no idea his wife was building the case that would collapse the very foundation beneath him. There were moments when fear crept in the middle of the night, in the quiet before dawn, when her hands hovered over her phone, and she wondered who else he knew. What if he already suspected? What if he had eyes watching her movements? What if his reach went farther than she could see? But fear no longer froze her. She took it as a signal to move smarter. She contacted a former legal assistant from Benton Marsh, someone who had signed a non-disclosure agreement but was let go without severance. At first, the woman refused. I can't, she said. He's protected. Serafina replied softly. I'm not asking you to speak out. I'm asking you to let me speak with what I already know. Just tell me if I'm wrong. The woman paused, and then whispered, You're not wrong. That night, Serafina sat on the floor of the guest room, documents spread. Out in front of her, highlighted sections and timestamps in neat rows. Her hands were steady, her breath calm. This wasn't hope. It was preparation. She was no longer questioning whether she had enough. She was only deciding when. The Moore name held weight. It opened doors, silenced rumors, and smoothed over scandals long before they saw the light of day. And Serafina knew what it meant to go against it. His last name wasn't just a name. It was a shield, a brand, a currency in rooms she had never entered, country clubs, charity galas, courthouse corridors where handshakes mattered more than facts. He didn't need to raise his voice to be dangerous. He just had to be believed more than she was. And for women like her, quiet, graceful, raised to avoid conflict, that was always the unspoken warning, don't make noise unless you're ready to lose everything. Serafina thought about that more than once, about what people might say, about the looks she'd get in town if this became public. She could already hear it. She had it all, and still wasn't satisfied. Why didn't she handle it privately? She should have just walked away, but none of those people had lived in her silence. None of them had watched the man they loved become a stranger with perfect manners. And none of them had opened drawer after drawer to find proof of people being used and discarded like broken tools, all while their abuser smiled for newspaper covers and gave speeches about integrity. Serafina wasn't scared of losing her image. She was scared of letting his stay intact. She met with the lawyer quietly, the one her aunt had recommended through a back channel, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair, sharp eyes, and a voice that didn't waste time. Serafina laid out everything on the table, every document, every name, every date. When she was done, the room was still. The lawyer didn't blink. You understand what you're walking into? Yes, Serafina said, but I can't carry this anymore. The lawyer nodded once. You're not just naming your husband. You're naming a system that's been protecting him. I know. There'll be backlash. I'm not doing this for approval. The woman studied her, then leaned forward. Good. Then we're ready. That night, Serafina sat alone on the back porch, wrapped in a shawl, a mug of untouched tea cooling beside her. The stars above her were quiet. She remembered a time when she used to wish on them. Now she didn't wish. She acted. The morning she signed the papers, the world didn't change. The sky didn't shift. The house didn't crumble. Alaric was already gone for the day. Another early meeting, another polished suit, another lie spoken with a smile. Serafina stood in the kitchen, dressed in a simple blouse and flat shoes. No makeup, no jewelry, her hair pulled back from her face. The lawyer met her at a quiet legal office 30 minutes outside of town. No signs, no waiting room, just a table, 2 chairs, and the first document, a formal declaration of conflict of interest and abuse of fiduciary responsibility. It wasn't divorce paperwork, not yet. This was bigger than marriage. This was the beginning of legal proceedings that would alert the right, agencies, financial investigators, ethics boards, labor departments, the kind of letters that made powerful people sit up. Serafina read each line, not because she didn't trust the lawyer, but because she needed to know, word for word, what she was saying. I am no longer complicit. I am no longer afraid. I am no longer silent. She signed. Her signature was steady. Her hands did not tremble. And just like that, it was done. She walked out of the building and into the sunlight, not victorious, not triumphant, but free in a way she hadn't felt in years. Not because justice had arrived, but because she had finally invited it in. That night, she prepared dinner as usual, set the table, lit the candles. When Alaric came home, she smiled as he kissed her cheek. They talked about his day. He said he'd be traveling again soon. She asked nothing. She nodded in all the right places. But inside her chest was a calm storm, not of fury, but of truth waiting patiently for its hour. She watched him from across the table, this man who once vowed she'd never know sorrow. She had believed him. And now she was watching him dig the very grave his empire would fall into, spoonful by spoonful, word by word. He didn't even know the ground had shifted. Later that evening, when he fell asleep beside her, Serafina lay awake, staring at the ceiling. No tears, no dread, only quiet. She had once whispered, "Please let me be wrong." Now, she whispered, "Thank you for showing me who you are." Because now she knew exactly who she was. The courthouse was full, not just of legal staff and journalists, but of curious townsfolk, faces Serafina had known for years, neighbors, choir members, former classmates, the same ones who had toasted to her wedding with crystal flutes and clapped as she danced with the man they believed to be perfect. Now they sat in rows, murmuring, clutching handbags and breath. No one had seen this coming, not like this. It wasn't the affair that brought them here. Scandals were not uncommon in the lives of men like Alaric. What shocked them was the scope, the weight. The paper trail now being unfolded one sheet at a time. The first pages laid out dates. The next ones exposed contracts. The following revealed employees terminated without cause, funds redirected into private channels, charitable donations repurposed for real estate. And Serafina? She stood at the center of it all, not fragile, not furious, but composed. The clerk called her name. She stepped forward. The wooden floor creaked under her heels as she approached the witness box. Alaric, seated just 20 feet away, didn't flinch. His expression was calm, polished. That trademark charm still painted across his features, the one that used to melt every doubt from her heart. But it no longer reached his eyes. She sat. The oath was simple, tell the truth. And she did. She began not with the betrayal, but with the belief. I loved him, she said. I trusted him with every corner of my life. Her voice didn't crack. I believed he was kind. I believed his empire was clean. I believed the things he told me, because I had no reason not to. Every word was clear. She didn't speak for pity. She spoke for truth. He didn't just betray me as a husband. He betrayed dozens of workers. He exploited small business owners. He built a castle on other people's broken backs. Gasps filled the room. Her hands were still. The judge asked for order. She continued, I came here today not because I want to ruin a man's name. I came here because the people whose lives he damaged, the ones who couldn't speak up, deserve to be heard. She lifted a document. This is a pay stub. The final one issued to Miriam Wells. She was fired with no notice after 10 years of service, no severance, no explanation. That same week, Mr. Moore bought a vineyard in France. Eyes turned to Alaric. He shifted slightly, but his smile didn't budge. The prosecutor asked questions. Serafina answered plainly. She did not embellish. She did not dramatize. She didn't need to. The facts were loud enough. Emails, signatures, shell companies. For each piece of paper, the courtroom seemed to sink deeper into stunned silence. Alaric finally took the stand. He adjusted his cuffs, sat up straighter, addressed the judge with smooth, practiced tones. This has all been blown out of proportion, he said. My wife is hurt, and I understand that. But there's no malicious intent here. His voice held steady, but his eyes flickered. I love Serafina. I always have. If mistakes were made, I deeply regret them. He turned slightly toward her. And I hope, once this is over, we can find healing. The words hung in the air like perfume. Soft, sweet, artificial. But this wasn't the man who wrote love notes on her pillow. This was a man trying to rewrite the ending of a story he thought he controlled. And Serafina? She didn't blink. She didn't shift. She just listened, the way one listens to a lie they've already stopped fearing. The second day of testimony brought the storm. Alaric had rehearsed well. His tone never wavered. His language was curated to the syllable. But the courtroom wasn't just listening to his voice. They were watching his eyes, his hands, his tightening jaw. And Serafina? She sat still, as if carved from quiet steel. Every time he tried to diminish the scale of his actions, a misunderstanding, business reallocation, misfiled accounts, the prosecutor responded not with outrage, but with evidence. A ledger appeared on the screen. Funds marked for employee health care rerouted to a private consulting firm, one owned by Alaric's college roommate, whose work never left a paper trail. Next slide, a charity receipt showing $100,000 donated to an education nonprofit. Next slide, an internal email revealing the funds went toward renovating his vacation home's guest wing. Alaric's posture shifted. He adjusted his watch, cleared his throat, but the court wasn't clearing its conscience so easily. A juror blinked, slowly, as if trying to reconcile the man in front of them with the man on those pages. Then came the video. Security footage from one of the companies he'd acquired. A tearful young woman, boxes in, her arms, being walked out by security after being fired for asking about overtime pay. In the background, Alaric walked past. He didn't look at her. He didn't even pause. Silence swallowed the room. Even the judge sat still for a long moment, before giving a curt nod to continue. Serafina was called back to the stand for a final round. Did you know this was happening while you were married? The prosecutor asked. I suspected the affair, she replied quietly. But the rest? No, I didn't know until I looked closer. He was careful, strategic. I think he believed I would never look. A pause. And when I did, He underestimated what I'd do with what I found. Alaric's lawyer rose for cross-examination. He tried to shift the narrative, painted Serafina as emotional, misguided, a grieving woman lashing out. But she didn't bite. "I'm not grieving," she said. "I'm awake." Alaric grew agitated. He leaned toward the microphone more than once, tone just a hair too sharp, voice losing its velvet. He interrupted, objected, whispered harshly to his attorney, and the more he tried to control the room, the more obvious it became that he was losing it. The press noticed. The jurors noticed. The judge noticed. The courtroom had come to see a powerfully built kingdom. Now, they were watching it crack, not from a dramatic confession, not from yelling, but from the quiet strength of a woman who never once raised her voice, and yet had the entire room listening. As court recessed for lunch, murmurs filled the hallway. "He's finished. She's braver than anyone I know. Did you see his face when that video played?" And Serafina. She stepped outside, not to speak to reporters, not to posture, but to sit on a bench just beyond the steps and close her eyes in the sun. For the first time in a long time, she let her shoulders fall. She breathed deep, not because it was over, but because she had finally stopped holding her breath. The final day arrived like the last note in a long, haunting song. Everyone was there early. Journalists pressed closer to the courthouse steps. Former employees of Alaric's companies showed up in quiet groups, some with clasped hands, others with folded arms in cautious hope. Even the judge's demeanor carried the weight of something closing. Alaric walked in alone that morning. No wife at his side, no entourage. His suit, while still crisp, seemed to fit tighter. He looked smaller somehow, as if the light no longer bent for him the way it used to. The judge took the bench and began the final review. Facts were stated, charges outlined. The damage wasn't just financial, it was human. Names were listed, families displaced, workers unpaid, contracts violated, promises broken. The numbers alone were staggering. Misappropriated funds nearing 8 figures. But the courtroom didn't shudder over numbers. It shuddered over faces. The prosecution's final statement was brief. Alaric Moore manipulated trust, not just in his marriage, but in every boardroom and breakroom that believed his word meant something. But one woman believed her voice could be louder than his silence. He gestured toward Serafina, and because of her, truth has a name again. Serafina never looked at Alaric as the verdict was read. She didn't need to. He was no longer the man she had once waited up for. He was no longer anything to wait for. The jury found him guilty on multiple counts: fraudulent misrepresentation, employee exploitation, and intentional misuse of funds, fines, penalties, assets seized. Some would go to court fees, some to the employees, some, it was ruled, to the charities he had faked donations to. But Serafina? She hadn't asked for a cent. She asked only for the truth to stand taller than his empire. And it did. It stood taller than gold-plated gates and tailored suits and gala speeches. It stood in her testimony, in her spine, in her stillness, and he could not shake it. As people filed out, a reporter called to her from the side, "Mrs. Moore, do you have anything to say?" She paused, then said quietly, "I forgive him, but I'll never forget what silence almost cost me. If you believe in justice, tap that like button to support stories that matter." Outside, the air smelled of sun-warmed pavement and old magnolia blossoms. Serafina walked down the courthouse steps, not with pride, but with peace. She didn't look back, not once, because some endings aren't meant to be watched. They're meant to be walked away from. The house was quiet now, not with sadness, but with something deeper, an unfamiliar kind of stillness, the kind that didn't ache, but didn't sing either. A middle ground, a pause between breaths. Serafina stood in the doorway of her bedroom and looked around. The rosewood armoire still held gowns she hadn't worn in years. The bed, once a symbol of whispered promises, was now just a bed again. Nothing more, nothing less. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She simply exhaled. After the trial, she declined all interviews. Reporters had offered book deals, speaking tours, exclusive contracts for her story. She said no to each one. Truth was never something she wanted to sell. It was something she fought for, and now she wanted to hold it close. Her days became quiet rituals. She began walking the old garden path again, tracing the same stones she used to tiptoe barefoot across in spring. The roses she once planted bloomed with casual defiance, as if reminding her that beauty could grow in the soil of the broken. She visited her father's grave and sat for hours. Not to talk, just to sit. Sometimes healing doesn't arrive with trumpets. It doesn't shout its name or declare its mission. Sometimes it's a bowl of soup you made yourself, or the way the sun hits the windowsill in the late afternoon, or an old friend showing up on your porch with pie and silence, knowing you don't want advice, just company. And that's how her life began to stitch itself back together. The nights were still the hardest. It's easy to feel brave at noon, with sunlight on your shoulders. But midnight? That's when doubt creeps in. Quiet, heavy, unwelcome. There were evenings she reached for a second pillow out of habit. Nights when memories replayed like an old record she couldn't pause. But even those moments grew less sharp with time. Not because she forgot, but because she stopped letting the past bleed into the present. One afternoon in late October, she wandered into the town bookstore, the one with uneven floors and a bell that chimed like it was out of breath. She was browsing the poetry section when someone cleared their throat beside her. He was looking for a book on vintage jazz. Said his record player had been a little lonely lately. His tone was soft, unassuming. He didn't compliment her smile or comment on her eyes. He simply asked if she liked Maya Angelou. She said yes. They talked for 10 minutes about rhythm and rhyme, then parted. No promises, no numbers, just a conversation between two strangers on a quiet day. She didn't think of him until 2 weeks later, when she ran into him again at the local farmer's market. This time he handed her a paper cup filled with hot cider and said, "I owe you a second poetry discussion." His name was Elias. He was a history teacher at the community college, soft-spoken, gentle in his movements, and always seemed to be listening even when no one was speaking. He didn't ask about her past, not at first, and when it finally came up, he didn't tilt his head in pity or offer hollow words. He simply said, "I'm sorry that someone failed to see the fullness of you," and somehow, that meant more than any apology Alaric had ever whispered. They began seeing each other in small doses. A walk through the antique fair, coffee in paper cups on a chilly bench downtown. A Sunday spent tending to her overgrown herb garden, where he asked what time was good for, and she laughed, really laughed, for the first time in months. Not because Elias was charming, not because he swept her into dizzying romance, but because he was safe. He brought stillness into her world without demanding center stage. Didn't fill the silence with flattery, didn't try to fix her, never once tried to complete her. Instead, he walked beside her, allowing her grief to breathe and her trust to regrow on its own terms. Sometimes they sat for hours in silence. No hand-holding, no confessions, just two people sharing space with no need to impress. And that, to Serafina, was revolutionary. There was a night, cold wind pressing against the windows, when Elias was about to leave after dinner. He reached for his coat, paused, then turned back. "Serafina," he said, "I don't want to rush anything. I just want you to know, if you ever decide to let someone hold your heart again, I'll be here, not waiting, just here." She stood frozen in the doorway, heart caught somewhere between fear and warmth, because for the first time since her world crumbled, she wasn't afraid of falling. She was afraid of believing, but deeper still, she wanted to. Later that night, she sat on the edge of her bed, holding one of the old notes Alaric had once left by her pillow. "You are my world," it read. She folded it in half, then again, then once more, until it fit in the palm of her hand. Then she placed it in a box, shut the lid, and tucked it high in the closet, not out of hatred, but out of closure. That chapter was over. It had shaped her, but it would not define her. A week later, Serafina knocked on Elias's door. No words. She just looked at him with steady eyes and said, "Would you like to take a walk?" He grabbed his scarf. No questions, just a quiet yes. Years passed, not quickly, not with haste, but with quiet, intentional steps. The kind that aren't dramatic or dazzling, just steady, just real. Serafina and Elias built a life that looked nothing like fairy tales. There were no grand gestures, no sweeping declarations, just morning coffee on the porch, a shared grocery list, arguments that ended with soft apologies instead of slammed doors, love that grew slowly, like moss on stone, rooted, patient, enduring. She never imagined she would become a mother. That part of her dream had felt lost. abandoned somewhere back in the halls of a mansion she no longer called home. But life, in its own gentle way, had other plans. And one spring morning, with Elias at her side, Serafina held her newborn son for the first time. He didn't cry right away. He blinked at her, quiet and wide-eyed, as if recognizing her soul before her face. She held him against her heart, breath caught, eyes full. Elias whispered, "He's going to grow up seeing what real love looks like." She couldn't speak, only nod. They named him Jonah, and Serafina, once the woman who had almost drowned in someone else's deception, now sang lullabies to the rhythm of his breathing. She gardened with him on her hip. She told him bedtime stories where the heroines were brave not because they never broke, but because they learned how to rise. And sometimes on golden afternoons she would sit beneath the old willow tree behind their home and watch him play. His laughter echoed through the yard, not the haunted silence of her old life, but laughter, whole and new. There were still memories, of course. There always would be, but they no longer weighed her down. They reminded her not of loss, but of distance traveled. She had loved deeply. She had been deceived. She had found truth. And she had healed. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Elias found her on the porch with Jonah asleep in her arms. He sat beside her, brushing his hand against hers. "You did it," he said. She looked down at their child. "No," she said softly. "We did." And the light in her eyes wasn't just peace. It was freedom. Serafina's story isn't just about betrayal or resilience. It is about truth, a truth many avoid because it's uncomfortable that love, even in its most enchanting form, must be grounded in honesty. We are taught to give freely, to trust with open hearts. But we must also be taught that devotion is not a vow to ignore the voice inside us. That voice, our instinct, our knowing, is not fear. It's wisdom. Love is beautiful, but it should never be blind. Serafina entered her marriage with the purest of intentions. She gave her whole heart, believing that love alone could build something everlasting. And for a time, it felt that way. But when the truth began to tremble beneath the surface, she reminded us of something vital. Love is not proven by how long we endure mistreatment. It's proven by how deeply we honor ourselves. To love someone is a gift, but to love yourself enough to walk away when that love turns dishonest, that is the mark of strength. Trust your gut, even when it hurts. There were signs, a shift in voice, a new scent, a subtle, sharp silence. So often, we silence that inner knowing to keep the illusion alive. But the longer we ignore it, the louder the pain becomes. Serafina did what many fear to do. She stopped dismissing her intuition. She followed the feeling that something wasn't right. And in doing so, she uncovered not only betrayal, but also her path to freedom. When your heart whispers a warning, listen. It is not weakness. It is protection. Justice restores more than revenge ever could. She could have crumbled. She could have sought to destroy him in bitterness. But Serafina didn't want destruction. She wanted truth. Her pursuit wasn't loud or cruel. It was deliberate, dignified. Every document she collected, every witness she approached, she did it not with rage but with resolve. Justice, when pursued through clarity and courage, doesn't just punish wrong. It restores what was taken. It tells every woman watching, every man who doubts his worth, every soul who has been used, you matter, and you will not be silenced. Real love is not a fantasy. It is found in truth. What Serafina found with Elias wasn't cinematic. It didn't come wrapped in roses or poetry. It came in the form of kindness, patience, consistency. He didn't sweep her off her feet. He stood beside her. He didn't promise to erase her past. He offered to build something honest for the future. In a world that glorifies drama and spectacle, Serafina's love story reminds us that the most extraordinary kind of love is the kind that simply shows up, day after day, as exactly what it says it is. Her story is not rare. That's why it matters. There are Serafinas everywhere, in quiet towns, in noisy cities, in boardrooms and classrooms, sitting at dinner tables, holding on to hope, trying to silence the doubt in their chest. This story is for them, to remind them that it is never too late to begin again. That love, when broken, does not mean you are broken. That rising from betrayal is not only possible, it is noble. So let this be the takeaway. Be generous with your heart, but not at the expense of your truth. Do not fear endings. They often point the way to beginnings you didn't know you were strong enough to claim. And know this, you are allowed to start over. You are allowed to heal slowly. You are allowed to build something new. You are allowed to be happy again. If Serafina's journey moved you, even for a moment, help us keep stories like this alive. Subscribe button to Mr. Ross Story Trail. Share this video with someone who needs courage. Signed, comment below. Tell us, which part of Serafina's journey spoke to you? Because someone out there may be waiting for a sign to rise. Your words could be it. Thank you for watching. Until next time, stay brave.